As the crisis engulfing the BBC and its soon-to-be former chairman, Richard Sharp, has played out, it's hard not to be reminded of that old adage, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Who Mr Sharp knew, namely former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and his failure to make known the fine details of their relationship, specifically his role in helping Mr Johnson secure a loan of a mere £800,000, resulted in his resignation today. Falling on his sword spared another of his contacts, the current PM, the job of sacking him. Rishi Sunak must now head up the task of replacing Mr Sharp. But should that really be his decision? Gary Lineker, who does seem to have got something of a taste for testing his bosses, said it should not be. And he's far from alone. Before the process has even begun, it's controversial.
It's an organisation that usually reports on what's happening across the country and world. But in recent months, the BBC has had to turn its focus inwards.
The chairman of the BBC, Richard Sharp, resigns after breaching the rules on public appointments.
A report today accused Richard Sharp of failing to declare key information about his links to government when he was appointed to the chairmanship.
I've always maintained the breach was inadvertent and not material. Nevertheless, I have decided that it is right to prioritise the interest of the BBC. I feel that this matter may well be a distraction from the corporation's good work were I to remain in post until the end of my term.
The issue came down to Richard Sharp's relationship with Boris Johnson.
Did Mr Sharp help you with your loan?
And failure to disclose his role in helping the former Prime Minister secure an £800,000 loan. After an investigation, Adam Heppinstall KC concluded there is a risk of a perception that Mr Sharp was recommended for appointment because he assisted the former Prime Minister in a private financial matter. They might also perceive that he was putting himself in a position where he might, if appointed, be beholden to the Prime Minister for his support, such that his independence from government was compromised.
He should have been sacked weeks ago. It was clear for everyone to see that he had failed to act appropriately in the process, and it has caused untold damage to the reputation and the independence of the BBC.
There are questions today not just about the findings of this report, but about the entire system and how it is that the rules say it is fine for the Prime Minister to appoint a close friend and party donor to a job as big as BBC chair. And that isn't new. Gavin Davies, BBC chair from 2001 to 2004, was a former Labour advisor close to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Lord Patten, who took up the role in 2011, was a former Conservative Party chair. For Richard Sharp, it's not just a link to Boris Johnson. He was also once the boss of another high-profile politician. So why didn't Rishi Sunak sack him earlier?
This is about doing things properly and professionally, and when concerns are raised, it's right that there is a proper process, an independent process.
Can I ask you about the wider system? There is no rule to stop the Prime Minister appointing a good friend or a party donor to chair the BBC, is there?
Look, this is bigger than a BBC story. This is a story about the whole public appointments process. It is frankly rotten to the core. It is ministers who decide who the candidates will be. It's ministers who decide which one to choose. And the panel who interviews them isn't even entitled to tell ministers who is the best one for the job.
All of this follows a period of intense controversy for the BBC after it took its biggest star, Gary Lineker, off-air because of controversial comments he made about government policy.
Goodbye.
Today he tweeted, "The BBC chairman should not be selected by the government of the day. Not now, not ever." But tonight, it's clear that the government and this Prime Minister will decide who becomes the next chair of the BBC.
And Anishka is here to talk about all this. So I'm smiling because you can't help feeling Gary Lineker is rather enjoying testing his bosses on a daily basis at the moment. But that's probably a different story. Let's just deal with this. We should make clear this is not about this government. Every government that, appoints chairs of the BBC, usually or often party supporters or party members. I mean, it seems odd, doesn't it, to a lot of people?
Yeah, it seems very odd, the idea that the Prime Minister might handpick the chair of a major news organisation which is meant to be completely independent. But I think it is worth thinking about why is it that ministers are involved in this process. It's because the BBC is a public body. It is one of actually over 300 public bodies. They spend between them over £200 billion pounds in public money. And so the argument for ministers' involvement is that there needs to be some sort of democratic accountability about the chairs of these different organisations. But, you know, clearly there has been a lot of controversy around this. Now, I speak to senior people within the BBC or who used to work within the BBC, and they say exactly what you pointed out at the beginning. Richard Sharp was not the exception, he was the rule, at least as far as the political appointment nature of it. And they say, actually, he had almost no overall influence over news. But that's kind of not the point here. The point is about perception, and that's what this report makes clear. If people do not trust the BBC, then that is a very big problem. And that's why experts call for things like limiting the role of ministers so that there is a more independent process to actually recommend who takes the job in the end.
Will today and the report into this change anything then, do you think?
Well, I don't think it's going to change the overall system, including a change that we already saw in 2016, which gave less power to the panels who actually do the interviewing. They can only say whether a person is appointable or not appointable. They don't actually recommend an individual anymore. No suggestion from government they want to change that. But Rishi Sunak will pay attention to some of the criticisms in today's report. For example, there were leaks ahead of Richard Sharp's appointment that said he was the Prime Minister's favourite. That stopped other people, perhaps, from applying from the role in the first place. It made it a much more difficult process. I am told by those in government that Rishi Sunak will look at issues like that and will try to make sure they don't happen as he now looks for the next BBC chair.